Good. Well, good morning and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm the lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace, and we have a lot to do in a very short amount of time. And so before we jump into the fearless conversation, I want to hit on just a couple things. First of all, in case you didn't notice, that was Jen's first time on stage. So would you guys celebrate her? One of the things that we love about this journey that God's called us into is this idea of multiplication, taking what we've received and building it into another and finding people's gifts and helping them develop that and continue to grow in what God has created them to be and to do. And so we're really excited about her taking that step. Another example of where we're seeing this in our church, and really it's everywhere, but another kind of fun one of someone who's taking their gift and just trying to figure out, okay, how do I help people find their way back to God better using my gift is something that I want to demonstrate for you today. It comes from our web team, and they're always looking at, okay, how do we communicate Christ more? How do we make it easier for people to hear what we're talking about who Christ is? And so they've developed this. Some of you know what Echo is, or Alexa. For those of you who don't, it's Siri, but for Amazon, and it's better. What I want to do this morning is just demonstrate something for you. So, Alexa, play the Hoboken Grace podcast.
You'd like to play the program called Hoboken Grace, right?
Yes.
Hoboken Grace podcast. Getting the latest episode. Here it is from TuneIn.
Excellent. Well, for those of you who are looking for the first time, so there you have it. There you have it. If you have an Echo at home, it's that easy to be able to listen to the conversation here. And again, it's just another example of that. I was just going to let that play. Just that would be it for today. That'd be our conversation. But it's just another example of people using their giftedness and just coming along and saying, okay, how can I use this? How can I use this to further help people find their way back to God? And actually, if you're here today, one of the things, some of you know that we have live stream here at Hoboken Grace. One of the things that we're really excited about is that we're trying to take live stream. We're actually going to be taking it to Facebook, so that if you're one of our Facebook followers, it's just when we go live, it's going to show up in your feed automatically. We're really excited about this because, again, it's just another way that we get to communicate who God is to more and more people. If you'd like to be a part of that, even if you're like, I don't know if I'm really good at that, but you're willing to be trained, our team does a phenomenal job of that. If you're interested in that at all, being a part of helping us do that, just meet after the service back at our production booth. It's right here in the back. You can't miss it. And they'd love to talk to you about how you can be part of making that happen. So that's just some of the cool things that are happening and different ways that God's using different people inside of our church family. But back to our conversation, Fearless. For those of you who haven't been with us for the last couple of weeks, we've been in the midst of this series, and we've been looking at fear and this incredible dream that God gives us, that perfect love drives out fear. And today, as we come to the end of that conversation, what we want to do is we want to give you a chance to be able to, and throughout this past week, you guys have been emailing in questions. We want to give you a chance to be able to ask questions, and then we're going to answer those questions. So what we've done over the past week is we put together some of the most frequently asked questions that you guys have emailed in over the past week. And I'm going to invite Anthony up to the stage, and we're just going to sit down. He's going to ask the questions. I'm going to try to do my best to answer those. So would you guys welcome Anthony?
All right. I never realized, but when it's your voice on that, then it becomes a real Amazon Echo. Anyway, they're not all going to be good, folks. Welcome to the Anthony Reimer Show. My guest today is Pastor Chris High. Let's give a hand for my opening band. And I wanted to call it something great since, the view was already taken, and since Hoboken Grace, we're a church. Welcome to the pew. And we're going to kick things off.
I have no idea what will happen.
So these are questions that came in this week from you all, and we're just going to ask them. We're going to ask the questions that you guys asked about specifically the Fearless series, and get things started. So
yeah, let me just comment on that really quickly, because some of you seem to have misunderstood this question idea, because some of you just went with like the hardest theological question you could possibly think of. Completely unrelated to Fearless. We're going to stick to the Fearless ones today, and feel free to approach me with the other ones later in the future, way later in the future.
Brilliant. All right, so first one that came in right off the bat, what do you do when love is not enough?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, and as we work through these different questions, I'll speak to it in different ways. But let me start here. I think one of the most important things for us to grasp in this and in answering that question is that love is never a means to an end. Whenever you start to look at love as a means to an end, you've actually left love. Because love is never a means to an end. It's never, I'm going to love so that they will, so that they'll make this decision, or so that they'll change, or so that this will happen. Love is never a means to an end. We don't love, when you look at that last passage that we looked at last week, 1 John 4:19, it says, we love because he first loved us. We love because we've been loved. We love because it's better to love than to be loved. We love because we want to be like him. We love because, again, in that passage last week, we saw in 1 John chapter 4, we can't show people God's face, but we can show his love. And so we love for them to be able to see that, not because they're going to do something but because it's what defines him. And this is an interesting thing about God. And again, in 1 John chapter 4, it says this. It says, dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God, but anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love. This is a really interesting thing, because when God talks about love, he doesn't say, I'm loving. He doesn't say, I love, or I like to love, or he actually says, no, if you could define me, it would be this. It's love. So he says, God is love. And then he calls us to the same thing. So Jesus, when he's talking to his followers in John chapter 13, he says, a new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. He said, this is going to be your defining characteristic. This is going to be the thing that sets you apart. This is who you are. Just as I'm defined by love, I want for you to be defined by love. You know, Jesus went to the cross knowing that most of the people that he was giving his life for were going to say no. They're going to say no thanks. But he loved them anyway. Love is not a means to an end. It's who we are. And so I think that you have to leave behind that mentality of means to an end.
That's correct. Moving right along. So this question came in, and I guess, I'm just going to ask it. It's a pretty strong question. Must we Christians always be the sacrificial lamb?
Yes. Next question.
No. All right.
No. This is a tricky question, and I say it flippantly, but at the same time, it's really very simple. The answer is yes. Jesus was the sacrificial lamb. What are we called to be? We're called to be like Jesus. I mean, to say that I'm a Christian means that I'm like Christ. Christ. The very word means like mini Christs, or people who are working to become like Christ. The problem is, though, we keep looking at that as a negative. So we continue to look at being the sacrificial lamb as a negative. Jesus looked at it as an opportunity and as a positive. And so he becomes the sacrificial lamb, and in it he understands that there's going to be a joy that he experiences in it that will be found in no other place. So he goes to the cross looking forward to the joy that's before him. Even though he despises its shame, he's looking forward to that because he understands that there's something in that can only be found there. And so the problem is we continue to look at it as a negative, and unfortunately, because we do that, I fear that we might be missing out on one of the greatest joys possible. And I think we'll talk about this as we move through the questions. One of the most important things that we have to grasp as we move through this, as we look at what God's calling to in Fearless, is self-preservation has no place in the life of a follower of Christ. Self-preservation has no place in the life of a follower of Christ. Our symbol is a cross. Jesus says, you want to be my follower? You want to be my disciple? Take up your cross. He's not talking about he wants you to carry a cross around. He's not talking about he wants you to wear a cross around your neck. He's talking about, I want you to be willing to die for people. That's who we are. We're the ones who die for people. So yes.
I think the next question is something that I know came up in my dinner group, and it's a question that I think a lot of us have had. If we look at scriptures, doesn't it say that we need to fear God?
Yeah, this was the most asked question, and rightfully so. We talked about it for just a little bit in the first conversation, but I'm glad that it was asked. I'm glad that you asked it because I'm glad to go back to it, and I want to be able to clarify this, if for no other reason than to give you the ability to have conversations with others about it and to be able to explain this to others, because you're going to say to others, well, we don't have to fear God, and they're going to say, well, wait a second, what about this passage where it says fear God? How do you interact with that, and how does John align with these other passages where you see him calling us to fear God? One of the things that you have to understand when you come to the scriptures, and this is actually one of the few places where this is true, but this word fear in the scriptures, the way that they understood the word and the way that we understand the word is very different. So for them, fear had two meanings. There were two expressions of this. So fear meant both the idea of being afraid, and then it also meant this idea of a deep respect or acknowledgement of power or submission to, right? I'll give you an example of where you see that really clearly, because the afraid definition doesn't work, even though they're using the word fear. It's found in the book of 2 Corinthians. And it begins in chapter 7, verse 13. I'll just read. Paul's writing to the church at Corinth. He had written to them in 1 Corinthians about a problem that they needed to deal with. They dealt with the problem, and so he's writing back to encourage them, and also writing back to talk to them about how they greeted Titus, who was the one who brought them the news about the fact that they needed to change. So he's writing to them in 2 Corinthians, and he says this. He says, we have been greatly encouraged by this. In addition to our own encouragement, we were especially delighted to see how happy Titus was about the way all of you welcomed him and set his mind at ease. I had told him how proud I was of you, and you didn't disappoint me. I've always told you the truth, and now my boasting to Titus has also proved true. And so he's talking about how they received Titus. He's like, Titus was really excited about how you received him, and I told him that this was going to be true, and it was great to see that actually proved to be true. He says now he cares for you more than ever when he remembers, and he's excited about the way that they received him. He says when he remembers the way all of you obeyed him and welcomed him with such fear and deep respect. Now either Titus is really screwed up, and he wants people to be afraid of him, or this word means something different to them. So Titus isn't excited because he got there and everybody's terrified of him. He's excited because of the fact that they submitted to him, that there was an acknowledgement of authority and there was a respect that was given to him. So they listened to him and they followed what Paul had instructed them in as far as how to be able to move forward. And so you see that it doesn't fit. The way we typically look at the word doesn't fit necessarily the way that they look at the word. You also see this in Revelation chapter 19. In Revelation chapter 19, at the end of the scriptures, when you see that the church is finally going to be united with Christ forever, listen to what it says. Beginning of verse 5, it says, "And from the throne came a voice that said, 'Praise our God, all his servants, all who fear him, from the least to the greatest.'" And you hear that idea, okay, these people fear God, but listen to the context of it as it continues. It says, "Then I heard again what sounded like the shout of a vast crowd, or a roar of mighty ocean waves, or the crash of loud thunder. 'Praise the Lord, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us be glad and rejoice. Let us give honor to him. For the time has come for the wedding feast of the Lamb, and his bride has prepared herself. She has been given the finest of pure white linen to wear. For the fine linen represents the good deeds of God's holy people." The picture and what's happening here is the church is being eternally united with Christ. And it's this picture of a wedding. And everybody's celebrating. And in the midst of this whole thing, you see the word fear. They fear him. Well, bride doesn't fear her husband like she's afraid, right? And it's not talking about that. It's talking about this idea of an acknowledgement of power, of respect, and a reverence to that, a submission to that. The other reason that we struggle with this is that we don't teach enough, or teach well enough, the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's very important when it comes to fear. In the Old Testament, they had to both be afraid of God and the idea of awe, reverence, and respect. Both were a part of the experience because they hadn't been born again. It's very dangerous to read the Old Testament like they have what we have. That's not true. The Holy Spirit wasn't given, they weren't born again, and they didn't have access to God. God dwelt in the Holy of Holies in a temple. And only the high priest could go in there. And even if the high priest messed up, and he didn't go through the rituals the right way, and he entered in the wrong way, he would die. They used to tie bells around the bottom of his garment so that if they heard the bells stop moving, they knew, well, he screwed up. And they literally would tie a rope to his ankle, and they would pull him out because no one could go in to get him. And there was a fear. You had to be afraid. Why? Because I can't come to God. I can't. But then when you come to the New Testament, that changes. Hebrews is trying to point that out in Hebrews chapter 10. So in Hebrews chapter 10, it actually references the Holy of Holies. And it's another one of these passages that's telling us, listen, you don't have to be afraid. That idea of fear, you don't have to be afraid of God that way. And so Hebrews 10, beginning verse 19, it says, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, we can boldly enter heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus. By his death, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain into the most holy place." So in the New Testament, because of what Jesus has done for us, because of the fact that we've been forgiven, because of the fact that we've been made new, Paul says we're a new creation, right? Now we have the ability to be able to walk boldly, without fear, without hesitation, into God's very presence. Now make no mistake about it, when you enter God's presence, you are going to be terrified. You're going to be terrified. John, who has the closest relationship with Jesus of all the disciples, when he sees Jesus in Revelation, he falls flat on his face. When you see Jesus, you will do exactly the same thing. But here's the thing about it. You don't have to be afraid. And even in that moment, Jesus welcomes John in. You don't have to be afraid. But we're still going to keep, even in the wedding, you see that there's still that reverence, honor, submission, acknowledgement of power. right? And so there's these two drastic things. In the Old Testament, they had both. They had to keep both. But when you get to the New Testament, that afraid part leaves. And then we just have the other. And also, let me point this out too, that the ability to be able to leave behind the afraid part is only because of Jesus. It's only because of Jesus. The writer in Hebrews 10 is making this very clear. He says the reason that you can leave that behind is because of Jesus. He says, but as he continues in Hebrews 10, he actually says, but if you reject Jesus, he says, if you know what Jesus has done for you and you say, you know what, I don't want it. He says, then you have to be afraid. And so as he gets to the end of the chapter, as he gets to the end of the conversation, he says it's actually a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. He says, listen, if you're going to, he says, if you reject it, you do need to be afraid, because God is a God of justice and love, and so therefore he's not okay with the way that we hurt one another, and he's not going to let that go without being addressed and without being punished. And so, and he's making it very clear, right, that all of us, and this is what I said in week 1, every single one of us, our journey with God begins with fear in the fact that we're afraid. We understand we deserve punishment for what we've done. But because of Jesus and what he's done for us, we can leave that side of fear, the way we typically talk about fear, behind.
One of the underlying things throughout that scriptures you've been pointing out is this love casting out all fear, and so one of the questions that came in had a few things to it, so they may have had a lot of questions on top of it, but they said, what does this love look like? Who is it directed at? How does it manifest? How can I show this love to others? And most importantly, when I find myself in situations where it is difficult to love, what can I do to renew God's love in me?
This has probably been the biggest area of growth in my life over the past year, and the biggest shift in my mindset. I think it was about a year ago, I was reading through the later writings of Peter, so 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and as I was reading through it, Peter said something that bothered me. Because as he's writing to this church, he says, seek peaceably, or seek to live peaceably with all men. And I read that statement and I thought, first off, that's really boring. and secondly, it bothered me because I said, is that really what it's all about? Because it sounds like he's just saying, hey, listen, don't make waves. Just don't make waves. And it bothered me, especially looking at who it was coming from, because Peter was the most driven of the disciples. And Peter was constantly saying, okay, where are we going to go next? What are we going to do? How are we going to get there? And I love Peter for that reason, because, as some of you may know, I'm a little bit competitive. And I'm actually hyper competitive, and I'm also incredibly driven. I grew up on a farm where if you weren't working as hard as you could, you were failing, and so you just worked as hard as you could at whatever was in front of you and whatever you were doing. And so I loved that in Peter, but then you come to 1 Peter, and he says, just live peaceably with all people. And I was like, seriously? Like that? It seems like a cop-out. And as I was reading through it, I thought, man, Peter, what happened to you? Like, what? Did you just get beat up? Did you just go through so much? And truth be told, by the time he writes that letter, he's gone through a lot. A lot. And I thought, man, was it just too much for you that you finally were just like, hey, don't make waves? But the more that I began to look at it, and the more that I began to interact with the book of Acts, I began to see that there was a shift that took place in the disciples' lives on the day of Pentecost, before the day of Pentecost, you see the disciples are constantly trying to one-up one another. They're constantly trying to outdo one another. They're constantly trying to impress Jesus. They're actually constantly telling Jesus what he should be doing. So, Jesus, you want to do this? No, we shouldn't do that. We should do this over here. And trying to direct him. On the day of Pentecost, that switches, and all of a sudden you see a group of people at the start of the early church who were motivated not by drive, who were motivated not by competition, who were motivated not by any type of personal ambition. They literally just followed. And when it comes to this question of who should I love, this is why you have to maintain a relationship with God. You have to maintain a relationship with God where you're constantly in conversation with him, because the truth is he's the only one who can answer that question for you. And the answer is not just go out and do as much as you can. No, the answer is you have to learn how to follow. To do what it is that he's asked you to do. And to stay close enough to be able to hear that. One of the things that we've developed is something called a rhythms book. We actually just released it this past Thursday at our night of prayer. It's just a community rhythm for us as a family, something throughout your day to bring meditation and a Bible reading plan, all these different things into your daily experience. Why? So that you can stay close. And it's in staying close that you begin to hear him lead you in, I want you to love that person, and I want you to do this, and so you begin to follow. The key is you have to follow. And I think, too, in that, one of the other things that's really important is when he does speak, so when he says, listen, and all of us have experienced this where God says, I want you to go talk to that person, or I want you to go do this for that person. The bad thing is it always comes at the worst time. You guys have experienced this? Mm-hmm. Right? It always comes at the worst time. And you've got somewhere to be, and you've got something to do, and you've got somewhere to go, and then all of a sudden God's like, oh yeah, I want you to stop, and I want you to do this. What I've found is that when you say yes to those things, all of a sudden it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, and God tends to speak more to the ones who say yes. And so as you develop that, then those questions, you stop trying to answer them yourself and you allow him to answer them. And it's also that intimacy with him that allows you to renew your strength and renew your ability to love the people around you. Awesome.
So one of the other things that we were talking about, this has come up in dinner group and as well as conversations with people, is these I don't want to call them practical fears, but there's no other way to do it. Different kinds of fears, for example. How will love drive out fear of heights? Or in my case, fear of snakes. Because I'm not about to love snakes. So are those good fears or that we should have? Or how does that translate into those type of fears?
Yeah. I think that's a great example of something that we've been mentioning throughout, that fear is supposed to be an alarm system. It's a great example of great alarm system, bad decision maker. And so you don't want those things to go away. You should feel fear when you see certain snakes. Not the fear that you experience where you run screaming like a little girl, but there should be some experience of fear. It's an alarm system, but it's a bad decision maker. And I do think this speaks to those fears, because when you look at Paul's life, not only did it drive out fear in terms of his relationship with God and the way that he interacted with people, but it drove out, he had to have been afraid of the things that he encountered. I'm pretty sure he would have been afraid to be stoned, right?
With rocks.
Yes. But I'm pretty sure that he would have been afraid of that. He's from Denver. Yeah.
Sure.
His mind goes to one place.
Make sure.
But you look at his journey. He's shipwrecked multiple times. He's actually bitten by a poisonous snake, And I think it's easy for us to say, oh, that's not important, that really doesn't apply to this conversation, but it actually does, because I often have conversations with people about missions trips. And God's calling them to love certain people, and they're allowing those fears to keep them from doing that. And I think that God's love speaks into our life where it allows us to be able to follow him, even though it may mean that we have to walk through some of those fears in our lives.
Wow, that's great. That's a really good analogy. What are some of the practical examples, speaking more practically, of when giving love makes love complete and drives out fear? We've also talked about that verse.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'm actually going to jump into that in a question later on.
Okay. Sort of answered. And at what point is it foolish to be fearless in love and giving? I think that was an important question too.
Yeah. I'm not, this was a question that I really struggled with, and just looking, okay, God, what do you call us to? I'm not sure it's ever foolish to love. I think when we talk about that, it's because of the fact that we have misunderstood what love is. And so we say, I'm going to stay with this abusive person because I need to love them. The abusive person needs you to leave them. That's what love is. And we misunderstand it. So we say it's foolish to love that. It's just because you're not actually loving. Because what they need to know is that if you continue to live life this way, you're going to be alone. And the only way that they're going to know that is if you leave them. And so you need to be able to walk away. And you need to walk away from that relationship. We typically look at love and we talk about this in leadership too. So people will talk about servant leadership and say, oh, you need to be a servant leader. And typically when we talk about that, people think, well, you need to be a leader who does as much as you can for everyone. Oftentimes, I encounter leaders who do everything for the people that they lead, and they say, well, I'm working at being a servant leader. A servant leader isn't someone who just constantly serves the people that they lead. A servant leader is someone who always does what's best for the people that they lead, no matter who that individual is. And so you see this perfectly demonstrated with Jesus, because Jesus was the perfect servant leader, so he always did what was best for the person in front of him. And sometimes that meant that he comforted them, and sometimes that meant that he confronted them. So you look at the interaction, people typically look at it and say, well, Jesus loved those who were struggling, but he hated the Pharisees. Wrong. Jesus loved them both. They just needed different things. And he did what was best for both of them. And what the Pharisee needed to hear was, you think you're okay, and you think because of your own self-righteousness that you're in some special standing with God, but you're not. That's what they needed to hear. I think typically when we talk about foolish loving, it's because we're misunderstanding what love actually is. And so I don't know that it's ever foolish to love the way that God teaches us about love. The only other thing that I'd say there is it might be foolish. It is foolish when it goes against what God has taught you, or it puts others above God. Right? So, because you talk about loving, giving. For example, for some of us, we give a lot, but we give last to God, or we don't honor God in our giving. Well, that's foolish, right? Or when you give to others at the expense of your time with God, that's foolish. It actually undermines your ability to be able to love them in the future. So that's the only way that I see that. So when you give outside of following, it's interesting. The last temptation of Jesus was actually about this. Luke 4, 9 through 12. It says, the devil took him to Jerusalem, the highest point in the temple, and said, if you're the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say, He will order his angels to protect and guard you, and then they will hold you up with their hands so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone. Jesus responded, the scriptures say you must not test the Lord your God. Satan says, do this. It's going to be great. People will see who you are. And Jesus says, yeah, it may be a good thing, but it's not God's thing. And so for me to do something that's a good thing but not God's thing is actually the wrong thing. And so that's what I would say if it's outside of what God has called you to do and to be.
The next question is a big one. In an age with so much terrorism in America and towards Americans, this person says, I'm worried about the refugee situation.
Yeah. And I was really glad several of you asked this question. I was really glad because this is where the rubber meets the road. We live in a world that is being ripped apart by fear and hate. And the two of them feed off of each other. And Jesus has put us here and has called us to be the ones who disrupt that. We are to be the ones who drive out fear with love. And we live in a world where it's everywhere. I remember when I was a sophomore in high school, I had the opportunity to switch schools, and I'd been going to a Christian school for most of my life, but I wanted to be in a situation where I could actually be around people who didn't know Christ and to be able to share him with others. And so my parents let me switch schools, and I was on the basketball team at this school, and I got to know a lot of the players really well, but one in particular, we were really good friends. His name was, we just called him Ballhead because he had a bald head like you. And I'll never forget it because we got to be better and better friends. And pretty consistently after practice, I'd come up to him and say, "Hey, listen, let's go get something to eat. Let's go get something to eat. Let's hang out. And without fail, every time it was no, 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 no. And I'll never forget the day that he said yes, because we were driving to the restaurant, and he was sweating. He was sweating. And this guy was huge, by the way. He was about 6'3", probably 6'4". He was an incredible athlete. He could put quarters on the top of the backboard. He was massive, a massive human being. And we were driving to this restaurant, and he's just sweating. And I remember we got there, and about halfway through the meal, I was just like, "Man, what's going on? What's happening?" He's like, "Man, this is really nice." And he said it in a way that he was surprised. I was like, "We're kind of friends. Like, why are you surprised that it would be nice for us to go grab something to eat?" And he said something to me I'll never forget. He said, every time that you invited me out, he said, I thought that we were going to go and you had all your friends ready and you were going to jump me." And this individual was African American. And he said, I thought you were just inviting me somewhere so you could jump me. I literally said to him, if everyone I knew was there, we couldn't jump you, but I said, why in the world would you think that? He said, ever since I can remember, my mother told me, never trust a white person. And as I sat there, I actually started crying. He said, I just can't believe that you would care about me. And he began to tell me his mother's story, and there was reasons why she said that. But that day, I got to be a part of love driving out fear. You want to talk about practical examples. The interesting thing is, if you really want to be a part of love driving out fear, you have to put yourself in situations that are uncomfortable and outside of your norm. And the interesting thing is that was a whole chain reaction of things, because it also went back to my parents trusting God's love enough for me to go to this school. I mean, in that school that year, there were 12 stabbings and 1 shooting, and it was like a banner year for the school. But my parents trusted God enough to do that. And that's part of love driving out fear. We live in a world that is crying out for someone to stop living a self-preservation lifestyle and actually love enough to drive out fear. Right now, the Muslim world is crying out for our help. And I'm not a politician. I'm not in government. That's not my decision to make. It's not my role. My role is the Good Samaritan. And we claim to be the ones who represent unconditional love. So when you look at what God has called us to be, and when you look at what we've been learning about Fearless, I believe our mindset has to be this. If they don't allow them to come here, then we should go there. Because we are the ones who die for people. We are the ones who give of our lives to show love when no one else will. I remember being in Sierra Leone, and we went to this missionary graveyard, the first missionaries to ever come to Sierra Leone. And the graveyard was filled with graves of 3, 5, 7-year-old kids. And their parents had decided to fearlessly take the message of Christ to people who'd never heard it before. And their footprints, their fingerprints are all over that country and the way that God used them. But if we're going to drive out fear, then we have to give up the self-preservation mindset. Because we may be able to continue breathing, but we will not live. And the reality is that this life is just a moment. And we do not live to continue breathing. We live every breath to communicate His love. No matter what it might cost us, no matter where it might take us. That's who we are. And it's time for us to be that. Look at that.
Will you pray with me? Father, thank you. When it feels like we continue to have questions and we continue to come back to this conversation because we see it means so much. It means so much to you. And as followers of you, it means so much to us. So, Father, my prayer, our prayer, is that we can continue engaging with you well. That we keep asking these questions and that we keep coming to you for the answers and not listen to what the world tells us. And keep meditating on that passage. That perfect love casts out all fear. Help that to be something that is written on our hearts. When we're worried to take that step, when we're scared to make that call, when we're frightened to move in that direction. That when we look at the definition of love, we see you. And as followers of you, our goal is to be a reflection of that. Help us to be a reflection of you, which is love. And it's because of Jesus. It's only because of Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.